Hello and welcome to Clamp, the weekly podcast where we talk about all things about creating, living, and making projects. I'm the host, Grant Alexander, and unfortunately this week, Adam's son is sick, so he won't be joining us. Instead, we got a returning guest, Keith Drennan from Blackthorn Concepts, and this week we also have a special guest. He hails from the Sunshine State in Florida. His days are spent loitering, and at night you can find him obsessing over Japanese tools. It's Chris from Cowdog Craftworks. Welcome, Chris.
Howdy. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Hi.
So, Chris, for anyone out there who doesn't know who you are, why don't you give a elevator pitch about who you are, where you're from, or not where you're from, who you are and what you do.
So I am the quintessential Florida man that you hear about on the news. Basically, I am a woodworker. I'm a hobbyist woodworker with a YouTube channel, Instagram, the whole nine on social media, Cowdog Craftworks everywhere with a focus on hand tool woodworking, Japanese tools, and really just having fun with woodworking for nuts and bolts of it.
Nice. Well, thinking about Japanese tools and thinking about hand tools and woodworking, that's why we got Keith on tonight, because he's also a big into woodworking. And I wanted to start this conversation off by talking about something that I suck at, and that's sharpening my tools. I have every once in a while I get to buy a brand new tool from a really good tool maker, and it comes, in my opinion, very sharp. And I use it until it's dull, and then I just hate my life. So maybe you guys could go over a little bit about what am I doing wrong? What's going on? Why can't I make anything? Is it because I'm using a strop? Is that what the problem is? Tell me.
How often are you using the strop?
Not very often. Depends on what I'm doing.
What kind of sharpening system do you do, or non-existent?
So I have, for my chisels, I have the Bridge City jig for holding it, and I have a bunch of different whetstones, and I can get them okay with it. I don't know. I got like Stanley chisels, so we'll leave it at that. But for my knives, I use the same whetstone, and then I just use the strop. But I find knives are so hard to sharpen.
You're talking carving knives.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll say like kitchen knives. I mean, for somebody like me where I do a ton of like hand sharpening, no jigs, I cannot sharpen a kitchen knife to save my life. My kitchen knives are the worst. I usually send them to the culinary shop down the way and get them to grind it out because I have no desire to mess with it at that point.
I've thought about getting one of those jigs with the arm, but
I've seen. Oh yes, the one that like clamps to like your countertop or whatever, and then it has an arm that goes. I think looks cool. I've never encountered anybody that's actually used one, so I don't have any, I guess, feedback.
For kitchen knives, before I got my 2x72, I was using. I bought a Work Sharp knife sharpener.
Yeah,
and that was great. And I bought that because my other sharpening system's the Work Sharp 5000, because I gave up on the stones. Or 3000 or 2000, whatever that little unit is. I bought that because I bought some used antique chisels and I wanted to put them into use. And doing that on a stone would have taken me forever. So I bought that, and now that's all I use. I have that with a leather strap and all the grits, and that's all I use.
So, Grant, I'll kind of like spoil this for you a little bit, and this might not be the answer you were expecting from me, but like, when it comes to sharpening, like the level of sharp or whatever is whatever you're most comfortable working with that you can get your work done, efficiently and well. Like if the tool is working as intended and you're okay with how it's performing, then that's fine. Like that's all you really need to get at.
Right.
For me, in Japanese tools and that whole rabbit hole, sharpening is life, that's what we do. That's our deal. So, for me, that is where I'll be frank. So we were shut down the past couple of days because we've had a hurricane coming through. So I've been, chilling at home, no court, nothing. And I probably spent the past like 16 hours sharpening, like just nonstop, like literally doing, it's a brand new, and I'm using air quotes here, but it's like a new old stock blade. It needs to be like dressed, it needs to be fit, all this stuff. And yeah, that's how I spent, the past 2 days basically, is just straight up sharpening over my sink. Yeah, I will say, so to kind of get into the evolution of that though, like when I first started sharpening tools, I used a piece of slate with like adhesive and sandpaper on it. And that was, honestly, I got really great results out of it. I used like, I think it was like automotive wet sandpaper, various high grits, and, that did the trick for a while.
I actually think I did better doing that than I do with a whetstone. If any,
well, I know why. It's because your stones aren't flat. Like, I'm sure you never flatten your stones.
I have flattened my stones, thank you.
Well, how often do you flatten your stones? Because that'll
every other time I use them.
So,
which is like the thing I hate about it. I'm like, fucking stupid.
I flatten my stones almost after every pass. So, I am like, as soon as I'm, like using, so it's a mostly audio only platform here. I know we have video, but if you picture your stone as like a rectangle, right? Like I start in the top left corner and I work sort of parallel to the edge with my hand. And I sort of just crisscross, the width and length of the stone until I get to the bottom right. And depending on which stone I'm using, I will almost immediately flatten it after I make that pass. And if you take a straight edge, like after you've used it once, you will see that your stone is no longer flat, like after just one pass like that. So that matters.
And you actually use the whole thing. So I go right in the middle and I only use that 100% of the time because that's the only spot I feel comfortable.
It's great because that means all your blades are cambered, so you don't have to worry about your edges digging in. Yeah. But yeah, so I got started with, like I said, a piece like slate, sandpaper. Then I started getting some diamond stones. I had like the little Amazon cheapy jig that's like $15 or something. It's sort of like a fake Lee Nielsen one. It's got like the same protrusions and everything. And then from there, I got into, I ended up buying a Tormek, and I used that for a while. Tormek is amazing, but really, really slow. It's very repeatable, which is nice. And the reason I got into the Tormek was because I got into turning. So I got all the turning jigs and all that, which, was a good time. And then when I got into Japanese tools, it was too slow because the hard steel that is like forms the cutting edge from Japanese tools is very high carbon steel. And the Tormek I'd be sitting there for like 3 days trying to get a new bevel. So that went out the window. And actually right now so primarily all my sharpening is done by hand, freehand. But if I do need to say like reset a bevel, like where I need to like actually change the angle, I'll use a slow speed grinder with a CBN wheel, so a diamond wheel. And that'll just throw like a little hollow grind on it at, whatever varying angle. And then when I go to like sharpen it, it'll obviously get to that edge and reset my bevel. So, and that's done by hand. But that's way faster. I mean, I'm talking 2-3 passes on the CBN wheel as opposed to sitting there for, God knows how long with a Tormek. So that's my sharpening evolution, so to speak.
So it seems like, and we'll probably get into this a little more because we're going to be talking a lot about like the evolution of your woodworking or your whatever craft you're working on. It seems like you start out with a way that works 90%. And then you try that last 10% seems to be the thing that you've tried. Like you're saying, you were doing it on the slate with the sandpaper and you're getting good results. And then you've spent all this time and money and doing all these other things to try and get it to that extra 10%. Is that fair?
Yeah, I will say a big thing is, and I kind of said this earlier too, is, I guess I didn't really say it outright, but like, so switching from Western tools to primarily Japanese tools was a huge like push in getting me out of, those sort of like, I guess, I don't want to quite say antiquated procedures, but, to get to something that's a little more traditional and a little more, I guess, structured. But even like, say, like I said before, getting the Tormac, right? Like I got into wood turning. So, I wanted something to be able to sharpen gouges and, do all that. And that made sense at the time. So, I keep kind of adjusting to do, whatever I'm into at that moment, I suppose. And, right now with the Japanese tools, like I said, the steel, I posted something on Instagram, I think it was yesterday, where I was doing this technique called uridashi. And so Japanese tools, their steel is a laminated steel, which is actually not super, there's this, I guess, misnomer that that's like super unique to Japanese tools only. But actually in like the early to mid 1800s, Western woodworking tools were also laminated steel. So if you look at a lot of like those old like jack and foreplanes, the big wooden ones from like England, like they'll have laminated steel blades. They don't have the hollow the Japanese steel has, but they are a soft steel on top with a hard edge steel on the bottom. And the reason for that is at the time, the high carbon steel was really costly to manufacture. And also if you were having it super thick, it would be really brittle. And, you'd have all sorts of like problems with, fractures, et cetera. So, it's kind of a genius sort of construction where they're like, hey, like, let's take some, wrought iron or some, really soft steel and just laminate it to the top of it. And that will give shock absorption. It'll make it efficient to sharpen. And, it's just a higher quality product at that point. And, what ended up happening with Western tools is that they switched to, something that was a lot more, I guess, cost effective and efficient to produce. So, you have these softer steels like A2, O1, which, for tool steels are fine. They work perfectly fine for the most part, but they don't, hold an edge as long. They, if you're using, say, a hand plane, you can tell in the finished surface. Like Japanese carpenters, like they don't use sandpaper flat out. Like sandpaper is like the devil over there. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is like when you're actually sanding something, the silica from your sandpaper ends up in your wood as well. So then if you try to go over that with a hand plane or, you're using a chisel, you're dulling your steel with the sandpaper that you were just using to try to, work on your project. So, there's a whole sort of variety of, things down there. So, to get back to where I was going with this was, uridashi is this process where, to get a flat back, you have to tap on the bevel of your very expensive plane blade with a hammer to push down that hard steel to give you, say, a flat back or to have your edge come into contact with your stone. So that way you can have, the general definition of sharp is you have two planes that are intersecting at a point with as few imperfections as possible. And, that's sort of the way you accomplish that. So there you go.
Right.
I was at a talk one time with Andrew Hunter, and he was saying, you don't know what sharp is until you experience sharp. And he was there to give a whole review on Japanese hand tools and all that. And it was an hour and a half talk, and the first hour was him talking about how he sharpens his stuff. And he was sharpening one plane blade the entire time and just talking about it as he's going and telling a story. And the entire time he's doing it, I'm like, I'm never going to use Japanese hand plane because if I have to do this much sharpening for the entire, like every time, I'm not going to do it. And then he gets done. He's like, who wants to try the hand plane? I was like, I'll try it. And I give it a go. And I've never had experienced anything that sharp in my life. And I know now I never will again because I'm not going to spend an hour. And then I asked him, I said, how often do you sharpen? And he goes, every 3 passes.
Wow.
So it's funny because I actually just took a class with Andrew probably like a month ago, something like that, on actually Japanese hand blades, which is kind of interesting because it was like an intro class. And like I've at least been using Japanese hand planes for the past couple of years now. But I've never had like physical, sort of hands-on instruction with it. Everything I've gotten is out of books, out of reading the internet and trial and error. Right. So having Andrew there was really awesome. And, it was just really cool to see. And so when he says every 3 passes, what he's talking about is with his like high, like his competition plane, basically. So, Andrew's one of the board. Well, is he the board member? He's really high up in Kezusa USA. And so Kezusa is a planing competition from Japan and sort of like a society. And really the whole idea is that they want to sort of like promote these Japanese tools because as I was talking earlier, the Industrial Revolution like sort of has made a lot of this construction and forging and, all that sort of obsolete, right? Like there's no, if you look at Western tools, like everything's like stamped out, like everything's, mass produced. The guy that made a couple of Andrew's blades, Yamamoto-san, he doesn't have an apprentice and he's like, I want to say in his like 70s or something. So once he dies, like that's it. Like, those, blades from him are gone. That's, they're not, you're never going to see them again. Whereas like, there are some other makers that do have, apprentices and stuff, but really the practice is fading. Like kids in Japan don't want to spend hours in front of a forge, like learning how to make these tools. So the hope is that like in Japan, they want the West, not just us, but like, Western, culture in general. So even Europe, et cetera, to start like making this cool again. So that way the kids in Japan want to do it. And then, it sort of has like a little revival. So, yeah.
I think they might be succeeding because at least once a month on various social media, unconnected to the woodworking, I will see someone pulling a like rice paper looking piece of wood off a hand plane. And people going like, wow, that's amazing.
So, when they do that competition, it's a specific species of wood that they use to get that.
Yes,
that
it is.
wide. Yeah,
it's Japanese cypress or sometimes cedar, but like typically I think it's Japanese cypress, which we'll get that. Yeah,
I've never
pretty
been
wild
able to get that. That's for sure.
It's pretty wild to watch.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I mean, the way that as you said with Andrew, right? Like every 3 passes, like there's guys with microscopes that are like looking at their edge after they've, polished it on a natural stone that is like the equivalent of like a 20,000 grit stone. Like they're maniacal about it. It's pretty impressive to see. But I mean, putting the competition stuff aside, when you watch like actual, say like job site timber framers in Japan, like they're sharp, like they're doing that, but they're not at that kind of level. They're at a more like practical, like, hey, this is sharp, but like I got work to do, like they're not sharpening every 3 passes, but a lot of them will, spend time sharpening at the end of the day, like with the tools that they used that day. So that way, the next day when they go back to the job site, like they've got sharp gear, like their gear's, all up to par. So
Andrew's a unique character though.
Oh yeah, he's really cool. I had a really great time just picking his brain and sort of getting to know him a little bit. And some of the hacks he had, like Japanese woodworking is so entrenched in culture, right? Like there's all these like traditions and practices, like it's almost a religious experience, and like he sort of adapts some of that, but then he has like these like little hacks that are totally not traditional at all that he uses. So a fun one is like, I've always had a nightmare trying to set the chip breaker on a Japanese plane. Cause for those who aren't familiar, Japanese planes are a wooden plane body, just one single block of wood. It's a wedged blade. You just tap it in there and it's not like super traditional to Japanese planes. Kind of came along a little bit later, but they have chip breakers. And so, there's a bar, your chip breaker is held and it's wedged in between the bar and the blade itself. And if you don't know the trick that I'm about to say, like you look at it and you're trying to like tap it in and you have no idea like the depth of the chip breaker. Like you don't know like where it is in reference to your edge because it's practically impossible to see. Like you're looking into the throat, you're like trying to like catch the light a certain way, standing outside, you look like a moron because you're like spinning in circles trying to see if you can like get the glint off of it just right. It's a nightmare. So I'm telling Andrew this because I'm like, man, like, and he actually said this at the start of the class. He's like, I want you to get more out of this class because, you're not a beginner in this. So he's like, feel free to use me for anything you need. And I was like, dude, chip breakers, like, let's let's do this. And so I'm telling him like, this nightmare, and I'm showing him like how I do it. And he's like, nah, man, like, let me show you a little trick. And so he grabs his plane. And so the blades on Japanese planes have these little ears. They kind of like from the sides just come in like maybe like 3 to 5 millimeters, like in that range, like from either side.
Yeah.
They're just towed in slightly. And he's like, grind your ears on a grinder just a little bit inside the chip breaker. So then when you are tapping the chip breaker, and he's like, you can flip over to the mouth and you can see the corner of the chip breaker sticking out past the ear. So that way you don't have to be staring in the throat in the darkness trying to like figure it out. He's like, you can actually just see the little corner of it come out, and you can get like this incredibly precise like hairline setting that is impossible otherwise. And it blew my mind. I was just, I've been fussing with it for a couple of years, like trying to figure it out. And he solved my problem in literally 4 minutes. So yeah, Andrew's a great guy.
He's a wealth of knowledge, that guy.
Yeah. Did you touch that? I mean, I would assume you touched the wood surface like after you pulled that plane.
Oh, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He had done maybe, he wasn't sharpening in between, but he had done maybe 5 passes to get it flat because he wanted us to try and pull a full length shaving.
Yeah.
And I got a full length shaving by no stretch of my own. I mean, he walked me through it. He did all the sharpening and he flattened it first. But it was like ready to be, it's done at that point,
Yeah.
And he was saying he does a lot with pine and he doesn't even use finish on a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So, when we're talking about like, say like, that finish, like when I was getting into that whole bit about like not using sandpaper, that's the whole thing is like when you have a sheared surface, there's actually like these microscopic, like you can go on like YouTube and like see the difference between like a sanded surface and a sheared surface and how the water contacts it. So if you have a sheared surface, the water will actually pool up because there's no abrasions. There's no like micro cuts in the wood. It's just like all your fibers are, perfectly like cut off. So like, it'll actually like pool up. Like it's dirt resistant, it's water resistant. And then, the sanded surface, like they'll drop the water and the water will just go like that instead of like puddling up.
Right. I actually like sand, not like I've seen people like sand like 4,000 grit. I'm like, that is stupid. You're going too far. The finish won't take. Right. Like, and then they'll like put an oil finish and it's like, no, the oil can't even get in there anymore. And I'm sure it's the same. If you plane with proper, like, whatever you guys are talking about with your Japanese planes and it's perfectly sheared, you put oil on that, it's just going to sit on the surface. It's not going to go in there. Right?
Yeah. So the oil finishes, like not as much, like oil will like kind of at least penetrate a little bit of the top surface. But to your point though, Grant, like say like varnishes or like a great example is Rubio. Like I actually use Rubio on a lot of stuff just because of the ease of it. But I remember I actually reached out to Rubio and I was like, hey, like, can I use this on a hand plane surface? And they're like, nope, it's not going to stick. Like it won't. Andrew was actually telling me a story about, I think it was like a torii gate or something that was in Japan, where after the carpenters were done and it was all erected and finished, they sent somebody out there to paint it and the paint wouldn't stick. So, these guys, the painters like out there, like trying to like fucking, paint the sides of the gate. And like, it's just like, I guess like folding off or something. Like it's just not adhering at all to the surface. So
that's crazy.
I know.
So if you want to like finish your project with stain or stuff, I've heard of like, I guess the problem comes about is unless you're really, really good at it, it's really hard to be consistent. So if you hand plane and then you try and stain it, if you're not perfectly consistent, you're going to get a blotchy finish. But if you sand, you got to be really shitty to not be able to just hit every bit with one grit, right?
So I don't know, Keith, you want to take that one? Because I almost have an opposite sort of position on that. Yeah.
So if you're hand planing, you should be watching what you're doing and get an even surface going across. But I do agree with Grant on the sandpaper if you miss a spot. But if there's nooks and valleys. Maybe you are going to miss a spot. I don't know.
I always feel like I see a lot of guys getting like sanding swirls, because they don't know how to sand or use their sander. Like, I saw something the other day. I don't even remember like what it was on, but like somebody maybe from like Festool or one of those. It was actually showing like how to use a sander. They're like, do not start your sander up here and then put it down because it's pretty rare that you're going to get it like perfectly parallel and flat. And then you're going to have a gouge and then, just stuff like that. And, like making sure that you're like, using the pencil marks, I guess, and sanding off all the pencil marks before you get to your next grit. Like, people, especially hobbyists, right? Like you have a weekend, you're trying to get this thing done for your wife. Like you're just trying to get through these things and be done with it. But yeah, like with a hand plane surface, like it just depends. Like I know when I was using Western planes a lot, I was dealing with tear-out issues a bunch. And that's actually one of the great things about Japanese planes. I've never used a hand plane that gives less fucks about grain direction than a Japanese plane. Like it's wild to see. Yeah. Like if you have a really sharp blade and your chip breaker is set properly, like, I'll plane directly over a knot and there's a grain switch and it's just mowing right through it. Actually, it's not at Maker Camp, but the Timber Inn a couple years back, where we do like the prep work for the timber frame. I was sort of just demonstrating, like how to plane, with a Japanese plane. And this one guy, Tim Zavacki, I don't know if anybody knows him here, but he was watching me as I'm, sort of planing a surface of a joint. There's going to be two mating surfaces. I wanted it to be flat. So I'm just kind of going cross grain, something super rough. And there was a knot and I just ripped the thing right off and pulled off a paper thin, like cross grain shaving of a knot. Like, and it just blew his mind. He was like, what in the world? And I was like, yeah. And part of it too is the thickness of those blades too. Like if you look, especially those old Stanleys, right? Like those blades are paper thin because they were cheap. So
yeah,
it was cost effective. These Japanese blades are, almost a centimeter thick. Like they're just no chatter mowing right through whatever's at it. So yeah, no, it's some pretty impressive stuff.
Are there any hybrid planes out there?
There actually are. It's not quite the same, but the closest thing I can consider to a hybrid would be, it's funny because like, I feel like Mackie would probably know about them, but the H&T Gordon planes, and those are sold domestically here by Heartwood Tools, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
but
I think you're right.
They're wooden body planes. They're not a wedged blade, but they do have a much more stout blade. And those are really cool. Those are closer to like Chinese planes a little bit. They have like this funny little crossbar that goes through them, so they can either be pushed or pulled. But yeah, and they're gorgeous. They're made with some wacky Australian wood I've never heard of. But they're beautiful.
I've swapped out some of my Western planes with the Hawk blades, and they're thicker. They're nice.
Yes. Yeah.
That makes a huge difference. Like if you're fighting with anything and you replace it with a Hawk blade, and they're not expensive. It's fantastic.
No, not at all. Yeah.
It's a game changer.
But before I got into Japanese planes, like full bore, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this guy, Mark Webster. He restores Stanley planes. Like that's like his thing. He's like out of California. I think he's retired, but like this is like his thing. He's just like, yeah. And he's very reasonable. Like you send him a plane that's mostly intact and, it could be a little beat up. The tote could be cracked, whatever. It could even be missing some parts. He'll, try to farm out some parts for you. But I remember I gave him a 604 Bedrock to restore. And he did a beautiful job on it. But one of the things he was like, do you want this thing to be period accurate or do you want it to perform? I'm like, dude, like I want it to perform, like for sure. And he's like, all right, like swap out the blade. Exactly as you said, he suggested a Hawk or he suggested a Veritas because Veritas makes the Stanley comparable blades with the PMV11 steel. Yeah. And let me tell you, like that thing is, it performs probably better than when it was initially made. I mean, hands down.
Yeah, it's a big game changer.
So did either one, to kind of go a little bit of, expand it beyond just planes and blades and sharpening, did either one of you guys start with Western saws and move to Japanese saws?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Chris? Were you
Same,
always Japanese?
same.
Oh yeah.
No, and actually for a while, I remember when I was first getting into like sort of this concept of Japanese woodworking and like the sort of more complex joinery and that sort of thing, I was doing all that like joinery with Western saws. And it was like a fun joke. I was like, yeah, it's like I'm doing Eastern joinery with Western saws, blah, blah, blah. Like, aren't I cool? But yeah, like it was, there's definitely a huge difference there. What I will say, if for folks listening or anybody here, if you really want to like level up your Japanese saw game, is to get away from those disposable saws and get like a proper like forged steel Japanese saw. They're not that much more. I mean, they're more expensive than a disposable one, but they're not much more. Actually, they're cheaper than a Western saw that's like a handmade saw. And they are like lasers. Like they are amazing. I've got a disgusting amount of them. I actually just got a ridiculous one. It is a rip saw that is like designed for hardwoods. So like basically, because I don't have room for a bandsaw, so every once in a while I need to resaw some, like 8-quarter material or something like that, 10-quarter. And so it's really designed for that. Like if I need to, I can comfortably rip like a 12-inch wide board with this, like, and teeth are insane. Like, and it's a really old saw too. I want to say it's from like the 30s or 40s. But this is kind of interesting. So there is a process that is called metate, and it is like a sharpening and tensioning. It's done by like a specialist, and the guy, my tool dealer, and that sounds funny, but like I actually do have a tool dealer. So his big specialty is saws. And one of the things he was saying, he's like, you'd be surprised. He's like, if you actually take your Western saw and you send it away to a Japanese metate for, the whole treatment, they're like, they will actually send this thing back to you, like singing better than you've ever had it. And it's really, that same concept of like making sure your plate is flat, making sure all your teeth are level, checking your set, making sure your set's optimized for either hardwood or softwood. Like they go through this whole thing. And to be clear, I don't sharpen my Japanese saws. It's just, I've got my hat or my, I guess, like hands in too many pockets kind of thing. Like I just don't have the time to learn, that process. So I just send it away, and these teeth last for quite a while. I put my stuff through the ringer. Like if I need something sharpened, it's like a yearly thing and I'm without it for, a few weeks, and I can live with that. So,
right. Keith, what about you? Are you disposable? Is that where you're at?
Disposable.
Yeah.
Yep. I should probably look into the other ones because I do enjoy using them. I hate Western saws. That's what I learned on. And I was never really good at them. It was always a lot of cleanup afterwards. So I always despised hand tool working just because the hand saws I used. That said, I probably never used one that was sharp, set right, any of that, So I switched over to the disposable ones because they're cheap and everyone raves about them. And I like it.
You know what I like about the disposable ones? When I drop them and I break a tooth off, I don't care. Right? Like it's just, it wasn't that expensive, right? Like I drop my tools all the time. So if I have a nice tool, it like goes in a case and I pull it out once and I use it and I put it back in this little case. And then I go, well, it's like I put all these barriers to me using them. And I don't want to do that. And that's why I buy cheap tools instead.
I dropped one of my plain bit blades last night while I was drunk in my shop. I was just really just putting things away. Like it was like late night and like, wife had gone to bed and I like went in there and I grabbed the plane and I was like just pulling the blade out to like, stash it somewhere, and it just slipped and then like somehow miraculously fell like flat instead of, like on the edge. And let me tell you, I almost had like a heart attack, like as it was all happening. Did
you break out the jeweler's loop?
No, I like just sort of like and some things I can kind of tell, and I like look, because especially from that height, I was like, if it landed on the corner, like it'd be really obvious. So yeah, I was able to tell that it was fine. I actually took a couple passes on it today just to double check, and I was like, yeah, we're good. So yeah, that was a close call.
I've bought a bunch of tools from old timers or whatever, and one set of hand planes I got, the guy gave me a jeweler's loop, and he's like, that's so you can know it's sharp. And I thought he was kidding at first. I threw it in the drawer with the hand planes, and I'm like, I used to work sharp. I don't care, right? Sharp is relative. And then watching your Instagram where you actually use the jeweler's loop to check it, I was like, oh, I guess people do this. I've never thought of it. I thought he was kidding with me, like, oh yeah, so it's sharp. I was like, this old guy telling me how to look for sharp.
I got into that process a couple of years back. This guy, Ryan from Scanwoods, he's based out of Skinny Atlas in New York. And he was like, he's crazy into hand tools, like really talented woodworker. And he started using a jeweler's loop, and I was just chit-chatting with him about it. So I just bought like a cheapy one online. And I was stunned to see like the difference. Like you can very clearly see. So like my sort of stone setup is like I have a 400, I have a 1,000, 3,000, 8,000, and then I have a natural finishing stone, which doesn't really have like a grit equivalent. It's just like a piece of rock from the earth. But if I had to guess, it's probably in that like 12,000-ish range. It just gives it a nice like muted polish, really soft stone. It's really cool. Anyway, but like going from step to step, like from stone to stone, you can really see the clear difference in the scratch pattern. And then you can also relay that to what the edge looks like. So, we were talking about sort of the difference between like a sheared surface and a sanded surface. Like this, I mean, really what you're doing is you're sanding your bevel, right? Or your steel. And you can really see, like, say after the 400, like that edge is ragged as hell. Like it looks crazy, like it's just all choppy. It's got little divots in it. If you have like little nicks in it, like it's super apparent. And then as you start working up, like you start seeing that go away. You see the scratch pattern, change. It's really wild. And even after my top finishing stone, right, there's still like little, and it's just because each one's an abrasive ultimately. So it's never going to have that like flat look necessarily.
If you use a strop, it might.
Oh gosh, do we really want to get on this one?
Do you not use straps?
I do not. So here's an interesting thing. Like I hate on strops, not necessarily because I hate strops. So let me sort of begin from the beginning here. Well, let me actually begin from the end, I suppose. Don't use a strop of Japanese tools. And the only reason you don't do that is because of that high carbon steel edge. Like it is a fast way to roll your edge over and have problems. With Western steel, however, because it's a softer steel, it is a tolerable thing to do, and it actually does help. However, the problem is that realistically, a strop should be used for sort of two purposes. And what ends up happening is people use a strop as a replacement for just sharpening. Like, I hear people that are like, oh yeah, like I'm just going to refresh the edge on a strop.
By people, do you mean Grant?
Probably, yeah. But, like if you've been stropping for 6 months and you think that is getting your blade sharp, like that is very, very incorrect. Like that is not happening. Like, that's just in your mind and it feels good. And it's like the placebo, like you're just popping the sugar pill every time you run it on there. But, realistically what a strop should be used for is like, after your sharpening process is over and you need to knock that burr off, like, yeah, absolutely. Like you got your strop with your polishing compound, like go nuts. As you use your blade, your, Western steel that's going to be a little softer, like it will somewhat deform your edge. And then the strop is a way to sort of straighten that out. So, if you can think about, say, kitchen knives, right? Like if you use a honing steel, the reason you use a honing steel is not because you're using the honing steel to sharpen your knife. You're using your honing steel to straighten your edge out because after chopping on a board of some kind, like you're just slowly bending that edge over and curling it and sort of creating a burr. So you're straightening, your edge back out. That is really the effect of a strop, is like really it's a honing steel for your tools. But like I said, people end up being like 6-8 months in. They're like, I haven't sharpened, but I've been, sharpening on my strop. Like, no, bro, you've just been polishing your edge and it looks super pretty, but that thing's dull as shit. So, that's kind of where I think, people need to get away from that. I do remember that Hui from Alabama Woodworker, he doesn't strop Western blades either. And he sort of does like the Japanese kind of way where he knocks the burr off on his finest polishing stone. So like whatever his highest stone is, that's what he uses to knock the burr off of. And his sort of concept was like, dude, I suck at using a strop and I'm scared I'm going to roll over the edge as soon as I got done doing all this work. So I don't do that. So, for him, a reliable way of making sure that he's knocking the burr off is on his highest quality stone.
Right. So I mainly use my strop on my my carving knives as a way to, like, you've used it for a little bit. Okay, strop it up. Right. But as soon as I've used them until they stop performing, I don't know how to make them sharp again. And strop definitely doesn't do that.
Yeah. And, that's exactly to my point, though, is that when you have two bevels that are meeting at a point instead of, say, a flat and a bevel, right?
Right.
So that's, I think, the difference really between using a knife on a strop. Like you're not so concerned about that flat, which I guess like with a chisel, practically speaking, it just depends on what you want, like as Keith said, like sharp is sort of relative to certain people. So, like if you care about having flat backs, like you're not using, say, reference faces or, fences to pair, that kind of thing. You're not relying on a flat surface, then by all means, strop away. Like if you think that's helpful. But, for a knife, like absolutely, like you have two sort of, bevels that are trying to meet at a point, like you can use a strop very easily to straighten that edge back out. And then, you're back to work. So, that is absolutely ideal for what you're doing.
Okay, good. Whew. Feel so much better about myself now.
Yeah. Just don't use it on your Stanley chisels.
Yeah. Or my turning chisels?
I mean, I don't know too much about turning tools anymore.
Well, I can tell you this. I wanted them to like shine because I got my Shopsmith from my dad and it had been sitting around and the tools were a little bit rusty. So I had, at the time, I was also polishing a whole bunch of aluminum on my trailer. So I had like, a grinder set up as a bench grinder I'd set up with polishing stuff. So it's like, fuck it. I'll just polish the fuck out of these guys. I made the mirror finish on these, but they were not sharp. Right. So like, yeah, they looked super fucking like great to look at, but they were not sharp. And I could tell as soon as you put it in there, put it on the wood, you could tell it wasn't sharp. And that's because the mirror finish isn't what makes it sharp. It's the edge.
It's the two planes meeting at an apex, basically.
Yeah, at the perfect angle through the entire surface. I think that's the big thing. Right?
Yeah.
That's why you need like straight. You need one surface perfectly. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not as romantic about sharpening as some people are. If I can get the tool to perform the way I need the tool to perform, then it's sharp enough for me. And then whatever way I get there is the way I get there.
Yeah. And I get that because, like a great example is when we're doing timber framing stuff, right? Like, if I'm there working on a 6x6 or, a 12x12 and there's work to do, like the last thing I want to be doing is like romanticizing about sharpening in the middle of the day when there's work that needs to be done, So like I sort of have this like little, I guess, brain meter for like what is an acceptable level of my tool to perform. And like once it reaches that point where I'm not cool with it anymore, then I will stop. But, let me tell you, that standard gets way lower when there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Like that is for sure, especially in a construction sort of application.
Right. Yeah, where it's especially if it's going to be outside, the weather is going to change that whatever your joinery you're trying to work on to the point where it's like it doesn't matter as much the perfect finish. Right?
Well, I mean,
that's relative too.
Yeah, if you talk to the Japanese carpenters, like that's the whole thing, right? Is like, that's why they have temples that have lasted for, 1,000 years, because they had plain surfaces. And
Oh, I thought it was Shushugiban.
Oh gosh.
I know, I said it on purpose. That was on purpose.
I was hoping that wouldn't come up tonight.
So Keith, do you know, I'm sure you know, like about
that it's not the correct term.
Yeah.
It has to be done on cedar. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
So for the listeners out there, it's yakisugi. And really what it is, it's just like it's super basic. It's just a mistranslation of the characters. That's all it was. Is like yakisugi ita means like grilled cedar board or plank, something like that. And like what Shoshugiban like looks super similar, like, but in that kanji, like if one little tail of one character is like off by an nth of a degree, like it changes the meaning of the word. So some knucklehead from HGTV probably saw it and was like, oh yeah, that's probably what that means, and they ran with it, and now that's what everybody says. So there we are.
And if you want more on that, go to what's his name? I'm Not an Expert.
Yes, I'm not an expert at this. His name's also Chris too. I do not recall what his last name is, but Chris is a great dude.
He has wrote an entire article about it, and you can read all about it. And we don't have to talk about it anymore. I'm sorry for bringing it up.
I will say, if you've never seen the actual process of how they do it with the siding, it is really freaking cool. Like they basically take 3 pieces of like siding board and make like a little triangle tunnel and like tie it with some wire and just stick it over like a little fire pit, burn the shit out of it. And it's like a little rocket stove. It's like shooting flames out the top. And then they take it, like wet it down to stop the burning process. They actually use a soft brush, not like a wire brush, to get like a lot of the ash off. And then they stack it and weight it, because obviously when you're wetting the wood that much, it's going to cause it to cup and warp. So they stack it and weight it and let it dry. And then voila, you have siding that'll last you, a lifetime. So it's super cool.
Yeah, I've been to Japan. I've seen some of it over there, and it's pretty wild to look at.
Yeah. And it's nuts that it lasts like forever. I mean, it's, and one of the crazy things about like their construction methods over there is that like, because, I mean, they do use mechanical fasteners, but because like joinery is such a big part of it, like everything's knocked down. So, they can take these like buildings that were built, say 400 years ago, disassemble them, find all the rotting components, recreate them, and then reassemble it. And I've even heard of them taking houses from like one part of the country and moving it to another part of the country, just, disassembling it, cleaning it up, and then moving it somewhere else. I mean, it is just, it's wild.
And yet when IKEA does that, everyone gives them shit. No, I'm just joking. I'm not going to get into that. That was a joke. But on that note, I think we should move on to the next part. And before we do that, I'm going to thank our Patreon supporters. The F-Clamp level are the top supporters. Everyone who supports us over on Patreon gets access to a pre-show. We had a great conversation, and an after show where we're going to be talking about how to respond to haters. And there's probably going to be a lot of swear words in there, so get ready for that. But you can just go over to patreon.com/clamp, and you can get access to that. You also get a keychain. It used to be made by Morley, but now they're going to be made by me. So head on over for that. Our F-Clamp level supporters. Cut? Sorry? Yeah, not laser cut.
Laser cut?
And you'll have to listen to the pre-show to find out that juicy one. Our F-Clamp levels, Brent Jarvis from Clean Cut Woodworking, Vincent Ferrari from Digitally Creative, Scott Oram from Dad It Yourself DIY, Joe Herdina, Lawrence from Maritime Knife Supply, and we have at 2 new F-Clamp levels this week. We got Rich from Low End Design and David Wood from DW Wood Builds. And I always get confused. He does stuff beyond wood, but his last name is Wood, so he gets pigeonholed into. I always think he's just doing wood stuff, and then he's blacksmithing. I'm like, but you're not stuff wood builds. Anyways, go check him out.
David's great. He's one of the timber frame guys, like every year up there. So
yeah, he's a good guy.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun.
So, thank you to everyone for that. And if you can't support us, we completely understand. Appreciate it if you share the show or write a review. And on that note, we'll go into Clampmendations. Clampmendations!
I know it's a woodworking specific topic today, but I'm going to recommend gnomehammerforge.
Oh, yeah.
He just put together, he's selling Christmas ornaments that are forged, but he's donating money to families in need in his neighborhood or community, I should say. So
very nice.
If you go check out his website's gnomehammerforge or go to his Instagram, there's a link to it there.
Cool. And we'll have links in the show notes to his stuff. Interestingly enough, I'm talking about donations and helping. Sharkattack1979. He is a person in I'm going to say Ireland. I don't know. I can't remember if it's which part of the Ireland he is in. I'm sorry. I'm pretty sure it's just Ireland. But he's over there in the across the pond. Anyways, he is doing a Movember campaign. He does them all every year. He's been doing it for 5 years, and he's raised 50,000 euros so far in that time period through him and his team. So it's a great cause, obviously, and he does some fun stuff, and he's got a whole team of people who are shaving their faces every week into a different, more ridiculous way. So you can follow along with that and donate to his Movember campaign. We've tried to get him on the show, but the timeline between Australia and Europe and Canada just didn't work out. So maybe next year we'll do it. Chris.
All right. So this is very low-hanging fruit, especially since I kind of mentioned it earlier. But what was it? Clampmendation? Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
Got it. So Clampmendation is Kezusakai USA. And one of the reasons I bring that up too is because Kezusakai so they're actually doing an in-person event at the end of the month here in Santa Cruz, but they also do a bunch of online Zoom classes. So if you were interested in getting into Japanese tools, it is a monstrous resource. And I know for me, when I first started getting into this, I sort of felt like I was a little bit out on an island, kind of. There's not a ton of community around it there, or at least I thought so at the time. And I was sort of figuring a lot of this stuff out on my own. And then lo and behold, there is this nonprofit society here in the United States that is completely dedicated to the proliferation of Japanese woodworking and culture and the education behind it. So, as I said before, to an extent, some of this is a dying craft and a dying practice. And this is a way to preserve it and to, get more knowledgeable about it. And candidly, as, Keith had said, he saw Andrew Hunter at an event, and it's just downright entertaining and educational, at the same time. So, if you're interested, feel free to go on their website. The classes are usually monthly. They're on Zoom. They're great. And the instructors are top notch. And they're hoping, I know, next year to do a bigger in-person event. They used to do some really massive weekend events pre-COVID. But they're trying to get back into, some more in-person events and really, kind of kick things off moving forward here. So, and as we're getting back to some semblance of normal, hopefully they will be too.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we'll have a link to that as well in the show notes once Chris sends that over, because I can't spell that word. So normally at this point of the show, we would do Adam's Slang of the Week, but Adam's not here, and I didn't prepare anything, so we're not going to do it this week. But I do want to thank TF Turning for the theme song. I want to thank both Keith for taking over on short notice when Adam wasn't available, and Chris for coming on and chatting with us. We've been chatting about you coming on the show for 2 years now, Chris, and it took you luring me into your trailer with the promise of a free t-shirt that never materialized at Maker Camp to finally feel like I was comfortable enough.
This sounds like a story for the after show.
I feel so bad about this too. And there's a box, literally, it's off camera, but it's to the left of me that I'm sure has your size in it.
Yeah.
But
sure
yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Chris, for coming on. I know you said it at the top of the show, but why don't you let everyone know, where can everyone find you?
Yes, so I am at Cowdog Craftworks on everything except Twitter, where I had to be Cowdog Craftwork because it's too many characters. So
Right. Well, just pay the $8 a month, and I'm sure that he'll let you do anything you
I'll
want.
get whatever I want at this point,
Yeah.
So, but candidly, I also don't really know how to use Twitter. I'm just there for some reason. So here we are.
All right. And Keith, where can everyone find you?
They can find me on Instagram on Blackthorn Concepts, or you can find me on the Working Hands podcast.
Perfect. And you can find me everywhere as the Grant Alexander. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And now to the after show.